Hello everybody, Pinstripe here. Welcome back to the Hogshead podcast. Today you're going to be talking a little bit more in detail regarding the stuff that I covered in the tanks, boats and planes video, which if you haven't checked that out, there should be a link to it somewhere at some point in this podcast. But that just kind of covers some of the info that I was given by Jacob Habgood regarding vehicles, game mechanics, and basically how they were intended to be used at a certain point during this game's development. So I want to start off with, of course, boats, because I've talked about them before, but knowing that there was meant to be a gunboat, which is the boat that we've all seen already, the launch, which was basically a troop transport, but having to carry either 3 pigs or a vehicle is an interesting mechanic, and we'll get into that as well. And of course the destroyer, which, as I said in the video, was basically an aqua tank. So maybe that gives us some kind of hint as to what it was meant to look like in terms of design. I don't really know, it's all really up to question. But it does yield the other question of how could water have been used, and the overall issue of, well, number one, the map size is way too small, and as I did say at the end of that video, water was a great way of dividing a level, and boats potentially took that away. And how he also said, I imagine they looked fairly unimpressive without the wake and wave effect, which, as I also said, was something that was different to today's game, because obviously the water is completely still. On the PC version it's got a little bit more of an effect on it, but on the PlayStation version it's fairly still, fairly basic. So without wave, it was fairly unimpressive, and I may post a video on it on social media just to show you guys what it was meant to look like, and what the waves actually meant. But overall map sizes were way too small, and yeah, I don't know, boats, and we've talked about the pig model size and the vehicle sizes, and they didn't really match up. The current vehicles that are in there with tanks, aqua tanks, pillboxes, artillery, they all make sense, and because you can physically see the pig jumping into them, yeah, I don't know, they seem to work. But with the boats, it could have been a bit different. They had to be a little bit wider, a little bit longer, a little bit taller, so width, height, and everything had to be adjusted to fit the pig model size. And when you've got a map whereby, say, a bit of water divides the two, and the water is not hugely wide, it's big enough for a pig to jump across, it's a bit pointless having a boat or a troop transport. And troop transports are a little bit different, because the launch, as I said, could carry 3 pigs or a vehicle. Now, actually carrying a vehicle is completely different, because that way, you know, a map could be divided in that maybe you've got some tanks on one side, some tanks on the other, and you need to get across, or you just, you know, it brings in the mechanic of, okay, well, I can drive the vehicle closer to the pig and get a better shot, or I can take my chances and kind of rely on my aim from a far distance, you know? And the troop transport, again, all comes down to size and whether or not, you know, it would make sense given that you've got one vehicle carrying another. How would that look? You know, again, raises more questions than it answers. From what I've seen, and as far as I know, the game mechanic of certain pigs not taking damage while they swim, so Commando, Ace, Hero and Legend, that mechanic has always been a thing since very early on in this game's development, and that also takes away from the launch or the amphibious, you know, because what's the point of jumping into a vehicle when you can just swim and not take damage anyway? I know that the speed of the pig is also a factor, because swimming is, as far as I'm aware, always the same regardless of the pig. I know that the top 3 characters run faster, but in terms of swimming, I have no idea, so maybe someone could find that out. That would be fairly interesting. But diving into the game mechanics that I then covered, the Legend, if piloting a vehicle, will yield a special attack. Now that's interesting because it only says the Legend. It doesn't say Hero, it doesn't say Commando. I know the Commando currently doesn't have that ability anyway, unless he's got a special ops or something. But because it's only dictated to be used for the Legend, that just kind of changes things up a bit, doesn't it? It's a bit different to what we already know. Vehicles should be quite rare, but balanced, with both sides getting the opportunity to use them on the same map. So I guess the overall design was, well, if we're going to have vehicles in this position, they've also got to be in this position, and then you've got to factor in how long it will take for the pig to run to them, how much time that'll take away from the player. You know, there's lots of different factors, and that also comes into map design as well. If a pig is in a vehicle and it's damaged, the pig will of course receive a lot of damage in itself. and this is of course a risk to the player. I think that's kind of a given, but I believe that the damage numbers were meant to be a little bit more, given that the health pools were a lot larger in the older version of the game. But the first pig to enter or use the vehicle is deemed to be the controller. Now this is also a little bit different to what we currently know, in that as I said, the first pig that jumps in is deemed to be the one who moves the vehicle in some way, and then every other pig that jumps in can only fire from it, so they can't technically move it around. That's essentially what I grasped from that, I think. I don't know if that's 100% accurate, but it sounds that way. Any pig in a vehicle who is not controlling it will be allowed to fire through any armoured slots. See pillboxes. So, yeah, but that doesn't really make sense though, does it? In that pillboxes can't technically move unless they were allowed to move, but we only know them to rotate, so that doesn't really make sense. Any pig in a vehicle who is not controlling it, so not the first pig that has jumped in, will be allowed to fire through any armoured slots. So maybe there were additional armoured slots in other vehicles, who knows. When this pig is selected to fire, the vehicle should be shown as a transparent object around them, affording a better view of the battlefield. Now that changes things up in terms of camera angles, so maybe you would get the first person view inside the vehicle, or maybe if you were firing from a certain angle, the vehicle would become transparent just to ensure that nothing would affect the player's overall viewpoint or overall aim, you know. But moving into the very juicy, interesting stuff, the effective firing range or field of the pig is compromised by the presence of a vehicle. The arc or line representing the estimated path of the pig's projectile will be shown in red if it is calculated that it will hit the interior of the vehicle. So that shows us in some vague way that there was potentially going to be an aiming system that was based on color. I vaguely remember or know that this is something that was used in Worms, where it would show you the kind of projected outcome based on color regarding how much damage or how well the shot will do. So if it's in red, it's going to do a lot of damage. If it's in like very light green or just a green color, it's not going to do that much. If it's in yellow, it's like a middle range, you know. So who knows what that was meant to mean. But if the player goes ahead with their shot when the arc or line is in red, the shot will hit the vehicle, damaging it, which is pretty self-explanatory. Explosive weapons hitting the inside of the vehicle, so perhaps there was some kind of just alteration in the way that explosives were used, in that they could actually penetrate vehicles somehow. Explosive weapons hitting the inside of the vehicle will harm the driver and any other pigs inside, as well as the vehicle itself. So maybe there was another alteration in that you could in some way see the pig that was inside it, or you know, somehow get a view of how many pigs are in there, because currently with tanks and pillboxes and artillery, as soon as a pig jumps in there, they are no longer visible and they almost become the vehicle in a way. But this rule is the same when firing from buildings or from behind any obstructions. Now, that kind of tells us that there were meant to be other vehicles, there were meant to be buildings, there were meant to be other obstructions. So basically the battlefield was a little bit more littered with different assets. And the buildings bit interests me because, as I've said before, Hogs of War doesn't really have that many buildings. There's certain levels in the single player campaign where there are, you know, little huts and things that house health kits and extra, you know, different weapons, that kind of thing. But there's never really been I guess something you could call a building, you know, because when you think of a building, you think, okay, it's got more than 2 floors, it's got a door, it's got windows, but there isn't any of that. I will be making videos on other maps, like a lot of the unused maps from the very early version of the game, and those will be coming out soon. There's just so much to make like content on at the moment. I've kind of got to put everything in order, but showing you guys how things used to look and how different it is compared to today's game, I'm quite excited about, and you can kind of understand what I'm on about in terms of buildings and how that could have changed things a bit. But in other news, I have actually been playing Worms quite recently, Worms WMD, which of course is still the 2D side-scroller, but it's a little bit more detailed, it's got vehicles, and it just got me thinking about different weapons and, you know, what my favourite weapons are in Hogs of War. So Super Airburst, of course, has to be up there because it does ridiculous amounts of damage, but I feel like that's kind of well adjusted, considering the fact that it is fairly rare in terms of where you will find it in the single player campaign. I can only really think of one instance where the player is able to find it, so it's more common in multiplayer than single player, but compared to how the game used to be and how common it was, in that it was available at least once for the top 3 promotable characters, I suppose, in the Commando, the Hero, and the Legend. Yeah, it was way more common. But again, factoring in the health pools and the different damage numbers, which I will dive into when I talk a bit more about different weapons in future videos and go into kind of their history as well, because it's not just characters, it's weapons, it's how things look, it's basically the entire game. And it is completely at our disposal, which is pretty awesome. So yeah, the Super Airburst is definitely one of my favourite ones, just because of its damage numbers, its craziness in terms of, I don't know, just how it looks. It's really satisfying when you launch the first shell, and then that breaks off into 2 shells, and then that breaks off into multiple little shells, and overall just does crazy damage numbers, which I believe up to 330 damage maximum. And as we know, that will pretty much take out any character in the game, so stupid amounts of damage being done with that one. But my other favourite weapon has to be the sniper rifle, which I know is fairly simple in terms of damage. It's got its set base 40 damage per shot, but I really like the way that the game kind of incorporates weather and time of day, particularly in the PC version. In the PlayStation version, if you're sniping from one side of the map and aiming for a target on the other side, the weather or the time of day will never obstruct that. But if you're on the PC version and you're playing at night and you're trying to aim at someone who is, you know, really far away, then you won't be able to see them because that part of the map will just be complete darkness. That was never incorporated into the PlayStation version, and I'm guessing that was just because maybe it took too much processing power. If you play the PC version, if you've got good specs, it doesn't really take much to run it, unless of course you're on Windows 10, lol. But yeah, if you've got good specs, you'll see that the game runs pretty smoothly, so I guess they had a little bit more leeway in terms of what they could actually get in the game in terms of little details like weather effects and time of day affecting gameplay. For the PlayStation version, obviously it was different, and you know, we know the limitations of that, so it is unfortunate, but I do like those little secret details that you kind of don't really pick up on unless you play the game a freaking ton, which in my case is certainly a thing. As I always do, I will talk about my favourite weapons and just weapons in general and everything and anything to do with this game in future. As I said, I'm trying to just plan things out and get things organised in terms of the content, how I'm making it and what it's going to be, because, you know, I don't want to constantly be churning out the same type of videos where maybe there's too much focus on maps or there's too much focus on characters. You know, it's just good to evenly space things out a little bit. So that's kind of all that I've really been up to at the moment, alongside animation and rigging work, which I will be showcasing alongside everything else in future. Long story short, there's a lot going on and a lot to come with this channel and the videos that I'm making. Obviously there's changes in that Hogs of War is the primary focus once again, and I'm very much down to making all this content, continuing this podcast, and just branching out and, you know, trying to expand the community in my own little way, alongside everybody else and all of you guys' support. You know, it's pretty awesome to see. But I know that there are going to be quite a few dips in terms of subscriber count, because a lot of the people that are currently subbed to this channel are mainly here for the TF2 stuff, and because that's kind of taking a back seat and I'm changing, the overall size of the channel is probably going to drop drastically, which is what I'm expecting, but that's not going to stop me from making the content that I want to make and stop me from making Hogs of War content as the primary thing at the moment. But TF2 and Lethal League and just everything else, animation, Source Filmmaker, that will continue. It just kind of takes a little bit more motivation for me to do that right now, because as I've said in previous videos and many times before, it chops and changes all the time, and really just depends on how I'm feeling at that given moment, you know. So do stay tuned for everything else. If you are interested, do subscribe if you haven't seen any of my content and you love Hogs of War. I don't really know what else to say, so I'm probably going to end the podcast here. A shorter one than before, but I'm hitting almost the 15-minute mark, which is fairly decent. I'm not really sure on how to gauge how long these podcasts should be, but I'm probably going to keep them at about the 20-25 minute mark in future. So there will be one or two like shorter podcasts as time goes on. But overall, hope you guys enjoyed. Let me know your thoughts on everything we've discussed today, and I will catch you guys later for the next one.